know already. Welcome to this webinar on creative problem solving in a period of uncertainty. In LBS, I'm a senior lecturer and I teach analysis of business problems and decision making. I also teach leadership topics across several programs. Been in LBS for roughly nearly 10 years now. And well, I guess the going has been great. Right, so let me begin by giving you a general overview, a general sense of how we're going to run today's webinar. I'll take the first 30 to 40 minutes or thereabout to go through some ideas around creative problem solving, guided by an outline that I will soon share with you. Then I will use the last 15 minutes or thereabout to consider your questions. Please keep the questions, stay on the topic as much as possible. You can type them into the Q&A box that you can see on your screen. While I'd like to provide solutions to every issue raised on this call or on this Zoom meeting, please keep in mind that our goal in this webinar is to give you some ideas about how to approach problem solving in today's world characterized as it is by uncertainty. So I'll just share my slides in a moment to give us a guide of sorts as we move along in the session. Okay, so like I said, the goal of the webinar is really to trigger some ideas around how to approach problem solving in today's world, right? So outline, we'll start with a brief definition of the CPS process. What is the nature of uncertainty with respect to CPS? CPS is creative problem solving. I will discuss a little bit about VUCA, which you probably have heard of already. Then number 3, we'll talk about this Cynefin Framework. Number 4, we look at how you should think about critical creative problem solving in uncertain context. And then I'll take your questions and we will conclude. I look forward to an exciting time and I hope that you have a good time too. So let me just start quickly by showing you what an iteration of creative problem solving. It's important to know that the creative problem solving is not new. It was developed sometime in the 50s and there were several iterations since then. And you can think about creative problem solving as addressing a problem situation in an innovative way. Yeah, and more and more in this generation, we find that it is not only the solution that is innovative or is new, we find that the problem itself is new. Yeah, so more and more emphasis is placed on the creativity with which we approach such problems. So a general iteration of the creative problem solving process includes, number 1, understanding the problem and challenge. And you notice that it's similar to the video that was showed just before we started the session. So first is understand the problem or the challenge. The second one is generating ideas. And the third is planning for action. Let me just explain this briefly before we go into the meat of the matter today. So when we talk about understand the problem or the challenge, really what we're saying is, first of all, do you know what goal it is that you're trying to achieve? The goal serves as a beacon, as I mentioned in that video, serves as a beacon that drives the actions and the analysis of the information and all of that you'll be doing. There's also fact-finding. Fact-finding is simply getting information about the situation that you're trying to address, and then problem-finding. A lot of times, we jump into making decisions or trying to find solutions to problems without understanding what the problem truly is. And it's absolutely important that we emphasize that a lot of times, also, we're not clear on the problem. There's a chance that we're going to be implementing the wrong solutions. I think that's a no-brainer, right? But so the second one, generate ideas. The key thing there is idea finding, and this is the crux, as it were, of creative problem solving in an uncertain context. And so we'll talk about that a bit more later. But one of the most common, and in fact, perhaps the most common technique for idea finding is brainstorming. Brainstorming, everybody assumes they know what brainstorming is, but there's a process to brainstorming, right? And it's quite systematic, and behind brainstorming is the ability to come up with unique ideas without judging them up front. Yeah. And then 3, plan for action. So this is where solution finding comes in, and acceptance finding. If you have any questions about this later, feel free to put it in the box. But my thought is to simply just present one of the iterations of the CPS process and then go into the main discussion with respects to problem solving in uncertain contexts. I should say also that creative problem solving requires both divergent and convergent thinking. And by that we mean, so divergent suggests that you are broad in your perspective, you're broad, especially when you're thinking in terms of idea finding. Your orientation is not limited by what you knew beforehand or what you thought had worked in the past, right? So that's where divergent thinking comes in. And convergent thinking kicks in at the point of the plan for action, where you start to, as it were, integrate the analysis you've done prior to the 3rd step, and then come to conclusions or reasonable judgments about the situation and how to solve it. Now, it's also important to note that this process is iterative, so it is not necessarily stepwise. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go from 1 to 2 to 3. There's a possibility that you might be in 2 and find out something you missed out in 1, and then come back to 3 or something. So it is iterative, and it requires a lot of flexibility in your thinking before you come to the point of coming to a conclusion. So let me come back to you directly, as it were, and continue this conversation. We've talked about the CPS process, and I have said that while it is important, it's only foundational to the rest of the conversation, right? So our focus is therefore on the kinds of thinking that will make the process most useful for you, right? We will come to that itself in a bit, but let me establish the context within which our discussion is being held today, right? And, because it makes all the difference to how we approach the idea of creative problem solving. If creative problem solving has existed since the 50s, and the conditions of the 50s are not the conditions of today, it suggests that, in thinking about creative problem solving, it's important for us to understand how context interacts with this. Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, we'll talk about VUCA. And I said that there's a possibility that you've heard the term VUCA before. And I'd say to you that about 2 years ago, I remember saying in a class that I'm sure everybody has heard about VUCA. I know what VUCA is right now. I mean, I'm tired of talking about VUCA. And it's amazing to see that we're only just starting as far as the complex environment is concerned. So let me not assume that we all know what VUCA is, right? So it is the term students of the American War College used to describe the nature of the post-World War world. And it stands for volatility. So the V is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So a couple of years ago, like I said, I thought I was done talking about it, but clearly that is not the case, right? So what's the connection between VUCA and problem solving? We see that in a VUCA world, the characteristic behavior, as it were, of the world is rapidity in terms of change, right? Things change in a rapid form. The environment of life and business change very quickly, right? So there's lack of clarity about the present, even about the present, which is where uncertainty comes in. There are also multiple factors that could affect your decision at any point in time. And there's a lack of clarity about the meaning of events. Yeah, so the implication is that the solutions that solved our problems the last time, right, may not necessarily solve what may appear to be the same set of problems today. So let me break down the nature of problems vis-a-vis uncertainty just a bit. Some years ago, some folks came up with a framework for categorizing different problem situations. They called it the Cynefin Framework. Right? Cynefin is spelled C-Y-N-E-F-I-N. It is a Welsh word, so it's not pronounced like English, right? So the Cynefin framework categorizes problems into 4 main domains. The simple domain is the domain of where cause and effect relationships are clear. I know that if I do X, I can expect Y results, right? Almost anytime and anywhere that happens, right? So here you simply assess the situation, you categorize them, and you respond with a solution that is based on established practice. Now, this is the realm of best practice. This is where, okay, so inventory is finished and we order more. End of story, right? So again, this assumes that all things are equal. It assumes that there's nothing that has changed with our suppliers. It assumes that we can continue to use and follow our SOPs and all of that, right? Because there's a measure of stability associated with this problem. The second level, however, is the complicated domain. Cause and effect relationship is also fairly clear in the complicated domain, but it is not readily evident to everyone. In fact, it's probably not readily evident to you too, but at least you know the information you require to solve the problem, right? So, so you can have multiple solutions or multiple possible solutions to the problem. And so a leader's response in this scenario is to assess the situation, investigate all the viable solutions, and determine which is most appropriate for the problem, and then respond. So this is the realm of analysis, clearly, right? This is a place where you look at, okay, how does this relate with that? And once you're able to simply pry into the situation, you're able to establish that connection and that relationship. Now, these first two domains, the simple and complicated, tend to limit creative thinking. Yeah, and the reason might be obvious, because here we're used to doing things in a certain way, right? We can be subjected to something called entrained thinking, or a conditioned response driven by experience. That's what entrained thinking is, right? Because we're used to following the SOP, right? Environments where these kinds of things easily happen, organizations there that are used to following SOPs. But remember that those SOPs have become a static mathematical formula for a lot of organizations, such that it doesn't give room for variability in context. This is the SOP, I follow it regardless of what's happening outside of the context of work, right? So, but we must remember that every formula, right, rests on the assumption that its components will behave in the same way regardless of the context. And so clearly, these first two domains are fairly constant, very stable, and we can, as it were, predict outcomes of our decisions in these situations. Now we go to two others that are not quite as stable or defined or predictable. One of those is a complex domain, right? The complex domain, cause and effect are not known. I don't know what will happen with a reasonable level of certainty if I take X move or Y move to try to resolve a problem, right? The whole in this kind of scenario is not necessarily the sum of its parts. You cannot definitely tell that the outcome of your decision will be A or B. You can only guesstimate, as it were, right? You don't know the extent to which your solution will solve the problem, but you can discover it, right? You can discover it. So for example, management changes, mergers and acquisitions, and those kinds of situations are situations that can be described as complex. They bring up complex problems, because indeed, every time there's such a thing as a merger, you're really not sure how it will affect the dynamics of the organization and all of those things. Yes, we can make an effort to understand it, but we are not guaranteed that our solutions will produce the expected answer. So here, a sense of unpredictability is introduced. And for the leader or any person that does not know how to deal with this, it can be unnerving, and you can become anxious and frustrated and take it out on your team by trying to micromanage them, yeah? Because you want to create a sense of a semblance of stability. You want to as it were, make things look like you are still in control, but in truth, you don't have that much control. So here, the job of the leader is to take a probing orientation to the situation. And what do I mean by probing orientation? Probing orientation is an orientation where you're more questioning, focused on understanding the situation than trying to solve the problems that arise with the situation in a direct kind of way, right? And so as you probe, you see patterns emerge, and then you respond. It is pointless trying to force order on such situations. Yeah, you can't force order on such situations. You simply have to watch patterns emerge and respond as the patterns emerge. Now, an extreme form or an extreme domain is the chaotic domain. That's the fourth one. In the chaotic context, not only are cause and effect not known, they are unknowable as long as the context subsists. If there's an explosion in the building, for instance, and there's fire everywhere, the first thing you do is not to try to find out what caused the fire. The first thing you do is evacuate, right? And get people out of the way. Yeah, and then you begin to ask questions later. This is kind of scenario where you act first and ask questions later. And your goal here is to establish a sense of order, right? No matter how minimal, in order to get into a position where patterns can start to emerge. And you begin to gain understanding of the cause and effect relationship as those patterns emerge. Fortunately, they don't happen too often for most of us, but we know that in this COVID scenario, this is a classic, probably a classic situation. So I've almost answered my question already, but we're going to take a poll right now. So you'll be prompted on your screen to respond to the question, how would you describe the current situation in our world as a result of COVID-19? Simple, complicated, complex, or chaotic? Let's wait for about 50 seconds to get your responses. Do we have responses now? Great. Well, so as expected, most of us have categorized today's situation as complex and chaotic, right? Somewhere between that space. And you're absolutely correct, because really, most people have not yet figured out how to respond to the situation at hand right now, right? Nobody's absolutely certain where COVID-19 came from. Many believe it was created in a lab, and there are various ideas about what country was host to that lab, as well as the motive behind it, because we don't understand the nature and dimension of the problem just yet, which is very characteristic of the complex and chaotic scenario. We're unable to adequately apply X or Y solution to it. The kind of situation this has created is what social scientists will describe as wicked problems, right? And that's exactly what creative problem solving is about. Wicked problems are essentially problems that you don't understand exactly the answers to the questions that are posed by the situation. You simply take action and watch patterns emerge and learn from those patterns and respond. So when you're faced with a situation that is closer to complex or chaotic than you care for, you must recognize that your bias must be towards action rather than over much analysis. Like the example of the fire that I gave, you can't have the building on fire and you're sitting to analyze without getting out of that space, right? So when you take action, you place yourself in a position to better understand the problem. This doesn't mean that you take blind action. It needs to be action that gives you the opportunity to gain better knowledge of the situation. And your ability to do that depends on a couple of other things we'll talk about in a moment, right? But it's important that we keep in mind that action is what to do when these situations are chaotic or complex, right? So in conventional problem solving, you find that the tendency is for us to do things like asking the 5 whys, root cause analysis, and so on. But remember that those techniques assume known relationships between cause and effect, right? So just keep that in mind. In creative problem solving, your approach to finding the problem and solution is necessarily experimental. Let me say that again. In creative problem solving, your approach to finding the answer to the problem, my apologies, is necessarily experimental. This is the first mentality or orientation that we need to adopt in an uncertain context. Adopt an experimental orientation. Problem situations worsen when we seek to apply ordered formulaic thinking to a less orderly and always changing world. And we wonder why things are not working the way we feel they should, right? We want to impose theories that were formulated in conditions of relative order, where cause and effect relations are fairly established, to less orderly context and expect that the result will be the same. But that's just not going to work, right? An experimental orientation requires that, that we're open to test new ideas in the light of the prevailing context, rather than holding on to the shadow of past interventions, right? In fact, the truth of the matter is that, let me digress a little bit. When you think about the way the brain processes information, some research has shown, also from neuroscience, that the brain processes information in such a, that we can categorize the way the brain processes information as system 1 and system 2. Where system 1 is the realm of automatic responses, right? And those automatic responses are born out of experience. They are born out of things that have been ingrained in our subconscious mind, right? But you see, system 2 is the realm of deliberate action, conscious analysis and thought. And when you get into a situation where you really haven't experienced this before, you find that system 1 is unable to provide a response, and you necessarily have to default to system 2, right? The issue that then comes up is, how do you use system 2 in a scenario that you don't know? You have no memories to rely on, you have no experience to rely on. I mean, you can tell me that, yes, we've had a pandemic in 1918, but the context of 1918 is not the context of 2020. Yeah. So while certain learnings can be gleaned from there, they cannot be directly applied to the situation we currently find ourselves. So let me emphasize again that the orientation we need to adopt, first of all, is the orientation of experimentation, right? So that brings me to second orientation, right? That is necessary for creative problem solving in uncertain times, and that's an appreciation of context. Yeah, I can't overemphasize the importance of recognizing context. I know we do SWOT analysis, we do PESTEL analysis and all of that, but even those frameworks have become formula, because as human beings, we are inclined to want to impose order on every situation. We don't like the discomfort that disorder brings, and you know that it's, you know, fair, it's to be understood, right? But the reality of today is that we don't have a fixed context, and so we must realize that context is everything. It's not just one of the considerations when you're trying to resolve a problem in uncertain environments. Context is the driving consideration, right? I remember the case of a lady that owned arguably the largest and best equipped supermarket in Festac Town, Lagos, many years ago, in the days of when Festac was a nice estate and all of those things, right? Her entire business model was built on the fact that the Festac of those days was a government-regulated environment with well thought out master plan that ensured order in the way businesses operated and what customers had access to and all of that. So it's almost as if the way Festac was designed guaranteed her a certain number and level of patronage from customers. Unfortunately, as context changed and Federal Housing Authority moved to Abuja and corruption generally began to get a foothold on how government functioned, she seemed to be oblivious to the changes. And by the time she tried to respond, it was too little, too late. And she had to pack up the business. And this was a business that was making ridiculous sums of money, even by the standards in the 90s at that time. Right? So let's realize that one of the most important things we can do for ourselves and our organizations today is to constantly scan the environment and reflectively evaluate how it affects us as businesses. Which brings me to the third orientation or capability we need to embrace and develop in a dynamic context, right? And that's the capacity for self-reflection or reflective action. Yeah, reflective action is the ability to mindfully take note of your actions, right? The outcomes of such outcome, the outcomes of such outcomes, right? The ability to mindfully take note of your actions, the results of such actions, the ability to interpret them correctly in the context of current realities, and integrate those learnings as appropriate. I said in a webinar we had last week that organizations tend to keep their people so busy. The managers are so busy. Everyone is struggling with business, and we don't have the time to reflect on the actions we've taken in the past and how it turned out. What we typically do in addressing problems is that once we've solved one and it has managed to work, we simply jump into the next one and assume that what we did the last time is going to work without understanding the relationship between the actions we took and the problems that we experienced, right? So, but we can't afford that luxury anymore. And so more and more now, reflective action is a capability that leaders must embrace. Yeah? Because it helps you to recognize patterns that emerge and then helps you to adapt as you move along. And finally, embrace diversity of thoughts in your teams, right? The days when the leader has all the answers, those days are gone, right? We need people that have not been subjected to our own entrained thinking to help us generate new ideas. It is important to recognize innovation happens at the intersection of difference. Let me say that again. Innovation happens at the intersection of difference, right? So it doesn't do you much good to have people that think like you as the only kind of people that's around you. If you're only comfortable with people that think like you, then this new world is not for you, right? The ideas that will save your job, your organization, your business, do not necessarily have to come from you or from the special person in your team or in your group, right? It can come from the person you least expected it from. It can come in the course of open, casual conversations with your team. It can come from various places. But for your team and the people that work with you to be in a position to provide such value to you, you must create an environment that allows people to express themselves without fear of reprimand or of being put down or fear of failure, right? The idea may not even come fully formed, but the right environment can cause it to evolve into solutions that you desperately need at that time, right? So I'm going to once again share my slides and just run through what we've talked about in summary, and then I'll take your questions. Right, so I talked about VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity as what describes the world we live in today. And then I went on to talk about the Cynefin Framework. And if you notice in this image, you see that the simple context is an ordered context, as we mentioned. And as you go down the line, things become less orderly. So when you adopt these strategies, what happens is that, well, theoretically, you move from chaotic to complex, from complex to complicated, and perhaps at some point simple, right? But again, I say theoretically because the rate of change in our world today may not allow situations to, may not allow situations to come to the point where they land on complicated or simple before another change happens and we have to respond again, right? So to that extent, we're probably now stuck in a world of continual disorder, as it were, right? And again, this is what I was talking about how, in relation to the previous slide, that understand the nature of the problem that you are trying to solve before you start to adopt solutions for them. That's what that framework does for you, right? And like I said, number one, for you to be able to creatively solve problems in an uncertain world, embrace an experimental orientation. Nothing is, no idea is useless upfront, right? No idea is useless upfront. Number two, actively appreciate context. Let the pastel analysis and all of those scenario planning and all of those things leave the realm of theoretical analysis. Let them become real to you in the way you apply it in your organization, and develop your capacity for reflective action. Take time to evaluate what you did right, what you did wrong, how it interacted with the context, and how it might play out in the next context. And finally, embrace diversity of thoughts and ideas in your team. You don't have all the answers, and no expert has all the answers, right? So be open to multiple ideas. So at this point, we will take questions if you have any. Okay, so let's see. Should organizations downgrade the use of SOP in routine business management processes? Good question, except that what you define as routine, is it routine? If you feel that it is routine, then by all means continue to use the SOPs, right? But my worry is that we are now, we're increasingly in a world where there's probably nothing routine anymore, right? And even if you decided that it was routine, you must create a situation where when the context around that routine changes, the people that supposedly use the SOP are in a position to escalate and say, I'm thinking that this thing is not going to work in this context, right? So the first thing is recognize or be confident that this is truly routine work. I mean, LBS, for example, routine for us was you gather in class, we teach you, you go away. Not so, right? But now we can't assume that that is our normal mode of operations any longer. Yeah, so you really need to review or revise those things that you describe as routine and ask yourself if your SOPs still work. Remember I said that SOPs are built on best practice. Best practice are historical. If the history is the same as the present, by all means continue, right? Do you have an online program that addresses this topic in detail? Absolutely. It's an online seminar. I think it starts next week, and it goes into a little bit more detail. Would you please send the slides with us to, okay, I guess that's asking for the slides, the emails. I believe that they will send that. Please, is there another session for this topic? I have been called for. There is no other session, but I think that if you registered, the recording will be shared. Yeah. So, what do you do when your boss continually turns down your idea, and when same is given from outside, it embraces it? Very good question. So the first thing I'd say there is that we need to understand why your boss turns down your ideas, right? So what is it about those ideas that he doesn't think, you know, that he feels that they're not valuable? Now, we know that it doesn't necessarily have to do with the way you present the ideas. There's just some people that don't think that the people around them are smart enough to respond to situations, right? So, but that's why I said also that one of the things that leaders must do today is embrace diversity of thought in their team. When you're having brainstorming sessions, for example, and you're getting ideas from different members of the team, you don't discard any idea in the first instance, right? So perhaps one of the things you could do is document those ideas and how you see it affecting the situation, right? So again, you also must have the mind, as it were, that you're not always right? But I totally get the bit where you say that when it comes from outside, he embraces it. It might be a question of how you present the ideas. It might be a question of the fact that he's not clear about how your idea connects. The other thing is that if he acknowledges you're right the first time, acknowledges you're right the second time, hopefully the third time he will listen. Yeah, but it's that's in the realm of managing your boss, I suppose. Let's see. Would you advise a review of SOPs whenever a complex problem is solved differently? So don't implement permanent change for temporary problems. If the problem is solved differently, there was probably a reason why it was solved differently. So for instance, if there was a flood, and as a result of that flood, the organization had to, let's say, rather than continue to use the staff bus, I don't know, something like that, the organization decided to hire boats or something like that. Perhaps SOP, reviewing SOP then would say something like, when there's a flood, use boats. I don't know, something like that. If that's the kind of thing you're talking about, yes, right? But recognize, again, it's always about understanding what the context is. It's not just about the nature of the problem itself. It is about the nature of the context within which the problem occurred. Yeah, and if the context hasn't changed considerably, you may not want to do that. But more importantly, there must be an orientation in the organization that says that SOPs are not, they're not cast in stone, right? If there's a better way to get this done, there must be channels within which, or channels through which people can communicate those ideas. Yes, you get the slides. Do you have another area? Would you advise SOP? Let's see. What do you do when you're about, okay, at what point do you take out emotions in all of these? Interesting question. But it's not a question that is easy to answer without a context. But let me say first, let me say from a scientific perspective that there's an part of your brain that controls emotions, right? So when you say take emotions out of it, that's practically impossible. But if you are saying the expression of emotions in the resolution of problems, that's a different matter. Simple decisions and choices we make, like what to wear, what to eat, the color of the building, the office building, the kinds of stationery we use, can be emotional decisions, right? So in itself, emotions are not necessarily a negative thing. They become a problem when you are seeing the facts of the matter on the ground and you choose to subject the facts to the emotions, right? That's where they become a problem. But I get the sense, and I hope, I don't know if I'm right, but I hope, I'm not sure why that came to my mind, so let me just talk about it, right? If, for instance, in a context like we currently are in, and organizations are thinking, gosh, we're not making a lot of money, we may have to lay staff off, but then you're also thinking, oh my goodness, these people are family people, and all of that. If that's what you're calling emotions, that's not necessarily emotions. That's just being responsible, right? That's being a responsible organization. However, responsibility also extends to the other stakeholders in the business. So if, for example, the organization really, truly does not have the finances to sustain salaries, for example, for a reasonable period of time as a result of COVID, then perhaps different creative ideas can be looked into to try to minimize the impact of whatever decision you have to make on employees. But recognize that it's a question of sustainability for all of us, organizations, the leaders, the staff, and even the society, right? It's a question of sustainability. This is a period you will encourage a startup even with insufficient resources in the family question. So if you could provide clarifications. I don't understand that question. All right. How do we get the core management to implement these models in a chaotic situation when everybody's reacting rather than responding? Well, that's part of why you're on this call. So Um, so hopefully they will get to hear. I don't know that you can get anybody to do anything. They simply have to know. And so if you can lay out the issues and the principles out in a way that is convincing, I imagine that they will roll with you. Would there be a certification that we can print as proof of participation of the same? In this webinar, not likely. Please, could you send me slides? We all get the slides. What do you do when your staff don't come up with ideas regularly, despite there is resource and enabling environment? How can you get them to be thinking? So you have assumed that when questions like this come up, the question I typically ask, throw back to the person that asked the question is, who is the person that is evaluating the environment to determine that the resources and the enabling environment is available? A lot of times we don't see ourselves, and there is a chance that while you think that you've created the enabling environment, your staff don't think so. There's also a chance that you don't have the staff that are in the position to come up with those ideas. There's also a chance that the methodology for making that happen has not been put in place. I gave the example of brainstorming, for instance, and I said that even brainstorming has a methodology to it. But one thing you can do, though, that could help is do something like dialectical inquiry or some. Okay, so there's a technique where you can simply ask people to give you their thoughts about an issue anonymously, right? And that we're going to come into a meeting to discuss it, but you don't want to know whose ideas is who, that they should send it to you anonymously or something like that. And when you come into the meeting, you ensure that you allow people to express themselves. But you see, in decision-making, we also talk about psychological biases. And there's a tendency for leaders to anchor their team members and their followers, as it were, on their own ideas. Let me give you an example. If I came to you and I said, you know, I'm trying to understand, I'm trying to understand how to evaluate XYZ person, because I really don't think the guy has done very well, right? And then you say that to your direct report and you ask for his opinion. You have already anchored him on what you expect him to say to you, right? So he's already saying to himself, if Oga does not think this person has done well, why would I open my mouth to say he's done well? So sometimes the way we ask these questions, the way we seek out for their ideas can affect the kinds of responses they give to us. So that's something you need to keep in mind. Shock most times creates instability and threat to confidence in the mind of the driver. What approach to overcome this? Okay, so I have a recent write-up on the LBS LinkedIn page that speaks about this issue. And essentially, I did recognize the fact that when we're faced with situations like this, the first thing that is hampered is our ability to see, right? In other words, our ability to envision the future. And envisioning the future defines our ability to make decisions in the long or even short term sometimes, right? So, and so one of the things I mentioned, there was an importance of not just being calm, but projecting calm to your team members. And projecting calm, I think I explained a few ways that you can achieve that. But it's important to recognize that your shock or otherwise, or your confidence or lack of confidence will not take the situation away. So one of the things you want to do is recognize the fact that you're not the only one that is experiencing that context, yeah? And keep open to, another thing I talk about in that write-up is that one of the things that will help you maintain calmness is to develop a learning attitude, right? So constantly check what's going on and recognize you're not the only one that is going through that situation. So that's one of the things you can do. The challenge is that when SOP is in operation, many times employees are denied the use of their creative ingenuity. I agree with you. And that's why I said at some point in this webinar that it's important that SOPs become a living document rather than a static document. SOPs need to become a living document that can be reviewed and refreshed. In fact, I think that term SOPs in itself is very static. Yeah, so but the important thing is to begin to see SOPs as a living document rather than a static document. How do you maintain a balance between creative and the use of SOP in a tightly control-driven environment? I think I've pretty much, control-driven environment. So maybe that is with reference to government regulation, maybe. I'm not sure if that's the reference, but one of the most controlled industries in Nigeria, for instance, is banking, isn't it? And when you see that one bank is doing better than another, it shows that one bank is demonstrating more, well, to some extent, more creativity than the other. So even within such context, there is the possibility to, to be a bit more creative than others. You may not be as extremely creative as the technology companies of the world, but there is a significant chance that you can be creative. The question is, you look for where you can be creative. What aspect of business can you be creative? Reaching out to customers, for instance, you have a lot of leverage, a lot of leeway for creativity in that. Yeah. So rather than allowing the SOP to hold you down, ask yourself, what are the areas that this SOP does not control us tightly on, that can help us be different or differentiate us in the industry. Consider constraints of time, cost, and quality. How does a leader effectively embrace experimentation, given that one has to meet timelines? Interesting. Okay, so depending on the context, there are different ways to do this, right? And I also like to say that when people are talking about the constraints of time and cost, sometimes you want to ask yourself also that, should the situation that you do not want happen, right? Wouldn't time and cost immediately, time, for instance, will immediately show up, right? So if you're looking at, should I do this? And you're saying, oh gosh, but I don't have enough time to explore this possibility, right? And if that possibility is a solution to a long-term problem or a long-term solution to a problem, when problems happen that challenge the status quo, all of a sudden the time we don't have shows up. So you really ask yourself, we need to ask ourselves sometimes if we're doing a realistic evaluation of time. But yes, I agree with you that cost is definitely, right, one of the biggest issues that people raise when it comes to experimentation. But again, take it in bite sizes, right? Do what it is you can do within your own context first. There are organizations that create, smaller teams where in that team they are allowed to explore and just, come up with all kinds of ideas, which when they see how well it has worked, they can then integrate them into the rest of the organization, right? That is their way of managing the issue of cost, yeah? But hopefully the idea of experimentation is that you are improving quality, so it shouldn't have a negative impact on quality if it is well managed. This is where techniques like, or models like design thinking come in, right? Because you are trying to solve a particular problem. So you're not doing this thing you're not being experimental just because you want to do something exciting. You're doing it because you feel there are issues to be resolved that this kind of experimentation will help you resolve better. Google allows their staff to work on projects outside the core roles, which has brought about great products for the company. How can startups do the same with limited resources? So if I take it from just your own first comment, Google allows the staff to work on projects outside the core roles. It doesn't have to be about resources. It doesn't have to be about resources. I can also tell you that we now live in a generation where there are many young people that do not want to sit with one thing only. So you actually have a new generation of potential employees that want to experiment, and it is simply part of the work for them. So I'm not sure that I see how money can be a problem here, right? When organizations say that, oh, this person should go from department to department, what they typically want to do is give the person a broad view of the organization. But beyond giving the person a broad view of the organization, you want the person to participate. Now, I think I should say something also, that the way we conceive of organizations today, we act like current organizational structures dropped from heaven, or they've been there for eternity. No, they haven't, right? They came up In fact, the organization as we know it today is less than 150 years old, right? So it just means that we must be ready to evolve. Yeah, we must be ready to evolve. And so all of the things we usually bring up as the reason why we can't evolve, if we don't move, the environment will move us out of the way. Yeah, I'm sure that everyone has heard the talk about Nokia when they said we did nothing wrong and yet we lost, right? I like to say that you didn't do anything is why you lost. So it's not enough to try to, we're not in a season or a period now where our focus should be on maintenance. Our focus needs to be on learning and changing. Very lucid presentation. Thanks, Yetunde. What is your sense of practical logistics to get CRS to policymakers in Nigeria that are paid deaf and up to practical ways out of COVID-19 a la Nigeria now? Okay, so this is a very loaded question. But I'm trying to be very careful about how I answer it, but let me say that I see everybody expressing different opinions on social media. And I honestly sometimes ask myself, and I also sometimes sit back and I say to myself that, are these guys thinking, right? But then I've also learned that we don't have as much information as they do a lot of times. So we probably don't understand the full range of considerations that are going into the decisions they're making. I don't necessarily agree with many things that have happened during this COVID period. But like I said about chaotic and complex context, right? You must adopt a mentality of experimentation. The problem will come, or the failure will come, if you choose not to learn from the experiments, right? Nobody has gone through this before. Nobody knows exactly how to handle this, right? So if you try this and you see it's not working, right, then you need to reflect and say, what have we done wrong? And then, or what have we done right? And then move on from there. But again, like I said, a lot of times we don't have access to the universe of information that these guys have. So we're going to have to give them the benefit of the doubt in that regard. But let's keep putting things up, posting things on web, if you don't have direct connections to them, keep putting things up on their websites and see and hope, fingers crossed. Can overloading with assignments not affect? Of course it can. That's exactly what I meant when I said that busyness, right? Organizations must consciously create opportunities for their team members or their staff to reflect. And it could even be a collective reflection times within the organization, right? To see what we did right, what we did wrong, how we can do this better and all of that. Without the boss anchoring everybody on his own ideas. It's important to emphasize that. What should an organization do if the business continuity plan does not work in its current situation? Change it. Is this a period you will encourage a startup even with this? Okay, that's the same question that came up earlier. I'm not sure I understand it still. I don't think SOPs should be discarded. I never said that, because the organization is to establish standards. Standards are established on the assumption of stability. When there is no stability, there's nothing like standards. Just keep that in mind. Continuous review is the watchword. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. What should be encouraged is a system of continuous review, which is exactly what we said. Yes, thank you. How would you manage someone in your team that you feel does not contribute positively? That's a very broad question. Flora, maybe at some point, if you throw me a mail with more detail, I may be able to respond to that, but it's difficult to answer that question right now. Please, can you briefly explain our current situation, how scenario planning is much applicable? When you say in our current situation, I'm not sure if you're talking about as a nation or if you're talking about as organizations. So again, that's another difficult question to answer, but I'm happy to answer it if you send me a little more detail. Wouldn't the experimental orientation approach have a negative implication on leadership? I'm not sure how. So if you're talking about you being able to say, I am the boss, then that is pretty relevant with all due respect. Let me explain what I mean by pretty relevant. You're the boss whether or not you lord it over anybody. Yeah, the experimental, so unless I don't understand where you're coming from, and in fact, I'm not sure I understand where you're coming from. It shouldn't, rather, it should get people to buy into leadership. I'm not sure I'm not sure I get the question, so please explain it further. Feel free to send me a mail. When do you think Lagos State should open this year's lockdown? I have no thoughts on that. That's up to Lagos State. What is the role of influence in critical problem solving? In preferring solutions to problems affecting organizations, is it possible the influence that can be wielded helps in acceptance of such solutions? Absolutely. I hope we mean the same thing when we say influence, though. But let me tell you a quick story. So there was an organization once, or there's a guy that he did the executive MBA in Lagos Business School, and he went on to well, he was working in a particular organization when he did that, and they were supposed to implement a very contentious program, right? I can't give too much details about the scenario now, but anyway, so I'll just leave it at a very contentious program. Somebody else was meant to lead that implementation. He ignored it for 2 years. HQ outside the country heard this guy out and eventually agreed that you drive the process, even though from the perspective of rank, he wasn't meant to be the one to do that. Now, what he did was he did his analysis, used all the critical and flexible, critical thinking and creative problem solving approaches he understood, came up with a solution and all of that. But he didn't go and slam the solution on anybody. What he did was that he used all that he could in terms of his negotiating tactics to guide the rest of the organization or the rest of the relevant parties in the organization through the process he had established, right? Which I think I'll be discussing in the webinar in the seminar that we have coming up next month, right? So he took the team through that process, and it got to the point where the team was able to see what he saw and were left to no option but to agree with him. Yeah, so one side of it is that you do your own critical analysis and come up with important solutions. The other side of it is your ability to manage people enough to take them through the solutions you've come up with so that there's buy-in and the organization is able to flow with you. We're going to have to close this shortly. Falling crude oil prices as a result of demand collapse is causing a rethink of business models. What suggestion will you provide to producers at this time? Once again, that's a very broad question, but if you send me more details, Samuel, I'll be happy to answer. Is at what point do you think it's necessary to implement new ideas, make it a habit within the limits of the organization's costs and time and all of that? And why do I say make it a habit? Again, I'll use the example of banking. There's at least one, not just one, but at least one bank in this, as stringent as the controls are in banking. There is at least one bank that is constantly churning out new ideas. It is not just because they want to churn out new ideas, but the concept of churning out new ideas keeps the organization agile. I think that's something we need to emphasize. It keeps the organization agile. So even if you don't implement all of them, you have a pool of possible ideas. The days are gone when the only person that comes up with a solution is the MD or the executive director or whatever, right? Those days are gone. There are organizations I know that they have a team that the only job, and I'm talking about Nigeria, that the only job that team does is generate ideas, receive ideas from the rest of the organization about how they can do things better, review those ideas, explore them, dump some, accept some, keep some in view, and all of that. So at no point are they left without a next step to take when context changes. So it's important that I emphasize that don't look at the issue of creativity and idea generation in organizations as something you do mechanically. It has to become part of the fabric of the organization for it to be useful, for it to be functional, for it to be valuable to the organization, right? So it has to be a culture. That's the summary of what I'm saying. what sort of impact broadly do you expect COVID-19 to have on Nigerian life insurance companies? Another broad question. I'm not an insurance person in any shape or form, but clearly one of the things that life insurance companies may start to think about. So again, insurance companies tend to have these exceptions. So except for, I think I got one recently, except for force majeure, something. And I'm thinking to myself, if we remove force majeure, when we are in a world where force majeure is almost becoming the norm, then what is the purpose of my insurance? So to that extent, I think life insurance companies need to start thinking about how do we make policies more appealing to customers, right? With respect to the nature of, but definitely yours is one of the organizations that needs to take things like scenario planning and risk analysis a lot more seriously now. What do you, or what can you suggest to the government in terms of policies of the economy? And that's a textbook, that's a project on its own. Right. Thanks, Yetunde. I'm comfortable with your response to the question on influence. Thank you. The scenario you talked about is a good example. Okay, great. So at this point, I think we've pretty much exhausted the questions, and I'm happy I was able to go through pretty much all of them. I hope you've had I hope it's been a fruitful use of your 1 hour. I've had a good time responding to the questions. So stay tuned, stay glued to the LBS website, webinars, seminars, and all of those kinds of things designed to help us go through this season successfully will keep coming up. Have a good day, everyone.